Hello, and welcome to this video series designed for speech-language pathologists who work with dual language learners of Vietnamese and English. In this first video, I will introduce some key aspects of Vietnamese American history and Vietnamese culture and language. After viewing this video, I hope that you will have a better understanding of the Vietnamese language as well as the social context for children growing up in the United States who are from Vietnamese homes. Here is a map of Vietnam and of the United States. Vietnam is located in Southeast Asia and borders Laos, Cambodia, and China. It is interesting to note that in terms of land mass, the country of Vietnam could fit inside the state of California. However, there are more than twice as many people living in Vietnam than California, roughly 96 million versus 40 million. Indeed, Vietnam is the 15th most populous country in the world. Over 80% of the population in Vietnam is ethnically Vietnamese, but Vietnam is also home to 54 different ethnic groups. The largest ethnic minority group is Cantonese Chinese speakers. In the U.S., there are nearly 2 million people of Vietnamese heritage, making the Vietnamese American community the fourth largest Asian American population. On the map of the U.S., the states with larger Vietnamese populations are shaded and include California, Texas, and Washington State. The lighter shading includes Oregon, Wisconsin, and Massachusetts. According to the 2010 U.S. Census data, the Vietnamese American population includes about 400,000 children under the age of 18, so many SLPs nationwide can anticipate serving Vietnamese children on their caseloads. On the left, you see the current flag of Vietnam. On the right, you will see the flag that was formerly the official flag of Vietnam. And this yellow flag is recognized in many Vietnamese American communities, U.S. cities, and states. The implication here is to be sensitive when creating educational materials. For SLPs working with Vietnamese American parents and communities, it is important to be aware of this controversy that has political and historical roots. Perhaps it is better to avoid including flags, either of these flags, in home programs so as not to inadvertently offend others. Here is a timeline of waves of migration from Vietnam to the U.S. A large number of Vietnamese people started to arrive in the U.S. in 1975, which marks the end of the war in Vietnam. This first group of refugees were mainly well-educated and highly ranked within the Southern Vietnamese Army, which was supported by the U.S. during the war. In 1978 through the mid-80s, 2 million refugees left Vietnam by boat. This group of refugees are often called the boat people. People left the country in small fishing boats and hoped that they would be picked up by larger naval fleets to refugee camps throughout Southeast Asia. This was a dangerous journey, without enough food or water, and many did not survive the trip. In the late 1980s through 1994, the U.S. accepted refugees under the Orderly Departure Program. About 700,000 people came to the U.S. during this time. Refugees included members of the Southern Army who were sent to re-education camps. In Vietnamese, this group of people are often referred to by the initials of HO or Hat O. Another group under this program were Amer-Asians, or children of U.S. Army members and of mixed American and Vietnamese heritage. Amer-Asians were often excluded from Vietnamese society as they were reminders of the war, and many of them did not have the opportunity for schooling. Finally, starting in the late 1990s and through today, waves of migration mainly consist of immigrants rather than refugees, who have been sponsored by family members or who marry U.S. citizens. What's important to note here is that different waves of migration represent different status, refugee versus immigrant, and different levels of education prior to the U.S. arrival. which in turn reflect differing levels of literacy both in Vietnamese and in English. For example, many recent immigrants from Vietnam who were sponsored by family members have had the opportunity to increase in their English proficiency before arriving to the U.S. When SLPs are working with Vietnamese families, it can be helpful to ask about the year of arrival to the U.S. The history of migration can provide a broader context to understand this particular family's history. Different waves of migration have included high-ranking, well-educated officials of the Southern Army and their families, to Amerasians who are often rejected from Vietnamese society and denied an opportunity for education. It is important to not presume a high or low level of literacy in Vietnamese or English. Rather, SLPs can work individually with parents and through an interpreter to provide verbal and written information in Vietnamese. Another consideration when working with Vietnamese American families is a potential language gap between generations. According to the 2010 U.S. Census data, most Vietnamese adults were born outside of the U.S., speak Vietnamese as the primary language at home, and over half of the adult population report speaking English less than very well. In contrast, many children are U.S. born. Vietnamese may be the first language spoken at home, though children quickly learn English through school and often become dominant in English later on. A much smaller proportion of Vietnamese American children learn to read in Vietnamese due to the lack of formal schooling opportunities for the Vietnamese language in the U.S. In being aware of a potential language gap between parents and children, it would be helpful for SLPs to become familiar with Vietnamese language and cultural resources in your local communities. Many studies that examine immigrant youth across several countries, such as studies conducted by John Barry, have shown that children and adolescents who have access to their ethnic language and community, as well as to the language of the larger society, have the best health and educational outcomes. Studies on Vietnamese communities in America by Bankston and Zoe have found that youth who are bilingual and biliterate are more engaged in the community and have high academic achievement. Another important aspect of Vietnamese culture is the high value placed on education. There is a Vietnamese proverb about education, Tiên học lễ, hậu học văn. It roughly translates as, one has to learn manners before letters. It means that to be an educated person, this does not just include academic learning. Children who are considered well-educated know how to show respect for others, particularly their elders. Once I worked with a Vietnamese mother who remarked that her preschool-aged child knew nothing. When I asked further what she meant by this statement, she said that when people come to their home, her child doesn't even know how to greet them. Especially for early intervention, it is important for SLPs to design communication goals and activities that incorporate this cultural expectation for manners and showing respect to elders. Helping a child express these values will help children successfully interact with adults in their home environment, which in turn will increase the number of meaningful opportunities to hear and use the home language. Now let's switch gears a little and focus on the main aspects of the Vietnamese language. Vietnamese uses a romanized writing system that consists of letters and tones. So as you see here, Tiếng Việt is spelled phonetically, and the tones are marked above the vowel in Tiếng and below the vowel in Viet. Vietnamese uses up to 6 tones, and the inclusion of tones affects word meaning. For example, these are all different words. Ma, 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 ma. Vietnamese is an isolating language, which means that it does not use bound morphemes or word endings to express time and number. For example, if I wanted to say one cat, I would say một con mèo, with cat being con mèo. If I wanted to say two cats, I would say hai con mèo. So I would use the same word for cat, and how you know that it's plural is that it has the number before it. Similarly, with verb tense, I can express time not by changing the verb itself, but by adding context to the sentence. So if the phrase is I eat, tôi ăn, I can say that I ate yesterday by saying hôm qua tôi ăn, so yesterday I eat, or today I eat, hôm nay tôi ăn, or tomorrow I eat, ngày mai tôi ăn. So rather than changing the verb itself, ăn, the context changes so that we know that the action is happening either yesterday, today, or tomorrow. If you're interested in a more in-depth comparison between Vietnamese and English, here is a paper I wrote that compares the two languages in speech, words, and in grammar. For the remaining time today, I will first compare Vietnamese to English, and then I will talk about Vietnamese-specific features. At the speech level, or phonological level, Vietnamese is a tonal language. It has 6 final consonant sounds, and it does not use consonant clusters. These features can influence English production, particularly with adults who are Vietnamese speakers in the process of learning English. Because Vietnamese is a tonal language, adult speakers may include tones in their English sentences, and that may interrupt English prosody. Because Vietnamese has a limited number of consonants at the ends of words, Vietnamese speakers may drop final consonants in English. So instead of saying ice, they could say I. And because Vietnamese does not use consonant clusters, clusters in English may become simplified. At the word level, Vietnamese has a different type of pronoun system called kinship terms, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Also, words do not change in form when they're going from nouns to verbs to adjectives. In terms of these features influencing English production, we could see errors in pronouns, so she versus he, or between subject and object pronouns, he versus him. We could also see children having difficulties with changing word forms. So instead of saying, this is so boring, with the ing, they could say, this is so bore, with the word form being the same as a noun. Vietnamese and English are very different from each other. However, both languages share the same word order of subject, verb, object. So because Vietnamese does not use bound morphemes and marks tense and aspect optionally, some errors in English that you may find is the omission of past tense or plural or third person singular. Also, Vietnamese allows subjects of sentences to be omitted when they are already known in context. So the subject omission would be considered an error in English, but that may be a Vietnamese influence. Finally, for Vietnamese, conjunctions are not necessary. So if I were to say, I walk, I run, I dance, I don't need to say, I walk and run and dance. I can just say, tôi đi, tôi chạy, tôi múa. So the optionality of including conjunctions could be influencing English if you're seeing a lot of errors with English conjunctions. Now, it's important to keep in mind that the degree of Vietnamese influence on English will vary by many different factors. First of all, it will vary by the age of English language acquisition. The features that I described in terms of how Vietnamese could influence English can often be found in adult speakers of Vietnamese who are learning English as adults. Many children may not have many influences from Vietnamese on their English, depending on whether they learned English from an early age or not. It also depends on the level of Vietnamese proficiency prior to English learning. So as children in the United States are exposed to English at a much earlier age than, say, if you were an adult from Vietnam coming to the U.S., the Vietnamese proficiency may not be fully developed and therefore may have limited influence on children's English productions. Finally, it's important to keep in mind the primary speech community. So if children are growing up in a large Vietnamese American community where adult speakers are also dropping English word endings, then the adult target may be more of an English dialect that is Vietnamese influenced rather than a general American English. So it's important to consider the primary speech community. What is the adult target that children are expected to obtain in terms of identifying whether this is a language difference or a disorder? So when we think about how Vietnamese can influence English, we need to take into consideration the age of English onset, and that should be included in any clinical assessment of children's language productions. In terms of implications for assessment and treatment, we need to know if adults in the child's environment are speaking a general American English, or if the dialect of English is really a Vietnamese-influenced English. The errors that they are producing in English may not actually be errors, but may be a difference versus a disorder. Also, we need to know the age of English onset, as well as the proficiency level of Vietnamese when we're conducting assessments with children. Because children who learn English at a younger age, we may not anticipate a lot of this Vietnamese-influenced English in their productions. Or children who are in the process of still acquiring Vietnamese may have different language patterns when we look at Vietnamese and English. And we'll talk more about this when we go into our video focused on assessment. Now I'll talk about two features that are not present in English but are very important in Vietnamese. And these two features are classifiers and kinship terms. Classifiers are words that precede the noun and that provide certain information about the noun itself. So for example, the word for cat, male, is preceded by the classifier con. Classifiers can substitute for the noun when they are already known in context. So if I were to say, tôi thấy hai con mèo, and someone were to ask me, bao nhiêu, as in how many cats, instead of saying the word for cats, I could just say hai con, so that the classifier con substitutes for the noun male. The most common classifier is cái, and this is a classifier for inanimate objects, such as clock or cái đồng hồ. And con is the other most common classifier, and con is for animate objects, such as cat, con mèo. It also can be used with some objects that are not animate, but that convey motion, such as a knife when you're cutting, and that's why it's con dao instead of cái dao. Finally, there are many other classifiers in Vietnamese, some of them indicating shape or the qualities of the noun that are more specific than con and cái, which are the two most common classifiers. We have limited information about how classifiers are acquired in the Vietnamese language, but from the few studies that we do have from Jenny Tran, we know that classifiers are acquired from a very early age in Vietnamese. The other Vietnamese-specific language feature that I'll talk about today is kinship terms. Kinship terms in Vietnamese are used in place of pronouns to address oneself and others. Within a family, kinship terms are very specific. For example, my grandfather on my father's side is ông nội, whereas my grandfather on my mother's side is ông ngoại. There's more than one term for uncle, although it's not shown here. An uncle who is older than my father is referred to as bác, whereas an uncle who is younger than my father is called chú. And kinship terms not only reflect age, in this case my parents' age, they also reflect which side of the family you are on. For example, my aunt on my mother's side is called dì, whereas my aunt on my father's side is called cô. Kinship terms are used within the family as well as outside of the family to address others. There are some similarities between Vietnamese kinship terms and other languages. For example, Spanish has two ways of addressing others, namely usted and tú. The Spanish system is binary and reflects formal and informal registers. In Vietnamese, though, kinship terms differentiate people based on age, gender, and status. Chinese has a similar system to Vietnamese in which people are addressed by different terms based on age and gender. However, in Chinese, you would address others by different terms, but the term you use for yourself is the same. This is different from Vietnamese in that kinship terms in Vietnamese affect how you address others as well as how you address yourself. So if I'm talking to a group of people of different ages and status, I will call each person a different term and also call myself something different as well. For example, when I'm talking to my older sister, chị, I would refer to myself as am. And when I'm talking to my mother, mẹ, I would refer to myself as child or con. And when I'm talking to my grandparents, I may refer to myself as child, as con, or I could refer to myself as granddaughter or cháu. Here's another specific example. Here we have a grandfather, a husband and wife, or father and mother, and their grandson or son. So the father says, cháu đói rồi ông ạ. And he's talking to his father, but he calls his father grandpa because that's what his son would call his father. Then the grandpa responds, lát nữa, ông mua bánh cho cháu nhé. So he refers to himself as grandfather, and then he's talking directly to his grandson, cháu. Then he turns to his son, and he asks, cháu có nặng quá không bố? So he's calling his own son dad, because that's what the child would call his dad. And then the father responds, con không mệt đâu bố ạ. So he refers to himself as con, or child, when he's talking to his father. Then his wife asks him, anh thích ăn ở công viên không? And so she calls him anh, and he responds as anh thích lắm, em nghĩ thế nào? So in this scenario, the father refers to himself as anh when he talks to his wife, and as con when he talks to his father. For speakers who are not used to the system, figuring out how to address others and how to address yourself can be quite challenging. It seems that it would require a good deal of theory of mind to know who you are in relation to who you're talking to. When I speak to people in Vietnam, however, people say that children catch on to the system easily, that this is not a problem in terms of acquisition. However, in the U.S., where children may have more limited opportunities to use Vietnamese with a smaller number of partners, kinship terms could be much harder to acquire. And then when we think about children who have a particular weakness in theory of mind, such as children with autism spectrum disorders, this task of how to use kinship terms effectively can be quite daunting. In Vietnamese, saying hello is not just a simple hello. It translates more into I greet you. Therefore, knowing which I to use, right, how to refer to oneself, and which you to use, how to refer to the other person, would make it very difficult for a child to initiate a conversation in a respectful manner. It means that the child literally would not be able to say hello. In 2007, Wing and colleagues wrote a paper that discusses how early intervention practice can become more culturally congruent. Before, I talked about cultural values and the high value placed on showing respect to elders. One way to incorporate this could be an activity in which a child has to greet others. If the technique is modeling or repetition, the goal is to repeat a target word in different contexts to help the child attach meaning to the new word and understand how to use it within a sentence. The conventional example is to take a label for an object and repeat it in different sentence contexts. So for example, here's an apple. It's a red apple. I like apples. Put the apple in the basket, please. If we wanted to incorporate the cultural value of showing respect, we could use a strategy of modeling or repetition, but within the social function of greeting others. In the alternative example, we see that the child gets practice with the word chào, or to greet, in order to greet different people within his family. Con chào ông, con chào bà, con chào chú, con chào dì. While both conventional and alternative examples have the same goal of increasing language input, the alternative example can be more useful for children to apply in their daily lives. In light of the proverb that one learns manners first, then letters, teaching a child to greet others will show that the child knows more than if a child can label objects. This concludes this video, which is the first in a series of videos designed for SLPs working with Vietnamese dual language learners. In the next videos, I will discuss dual language learners with and without developmental language disorder, as well as clinical implications for assessment and treatment. Please take a moment to complete the quiz below to review the main concepts from this video.